Alaria had stayed with Trollian that night. They had talked for a long, long time, and the chasm that had yawned between them had bridged. When they could speak no longer, they let their hearts and bodies continue the healing. They had emerged from his quarters together the next morning, and if there were knowing grins from their friends, both knew there was also genuine happiness. Even though they faced death today, they would do so knowing that there was much joy waiting for them if they survived. And they would survive. Trollian was not about to let her go, not now that they'd found each other again. He had kissed her hard, and she had slipped off in the pre-dawn light with her rangers. They had discussed signals and such, and finally decided on a time. We will douse the lights for 10 heartbeats, then relight them if we have taken the watchtower, she had said. If we haven't taken them, all by the time the sun is about to clear the horizon come anyway. Alaria had said, they will be able to see you as well. They will be able to see as well as you an hour later, and this plan will have been for naught. He nodded. Trollian was at peace with her fighting out of his sight now. He knew she would take no unnecessary risk. She'd return to herself again. Daneth would lead the initial decoy charge, while Trollian would bring up the main offense once the Horde forces had engaged them in combat. Daneth and his men would be outnumbered, but not for long. It will be harrowing for a while, Trollian warned him. You'll have to trust that all is going according to plan. He hesitated. It might feel like the portal battle all over again, Daneth. Daneth had regarded his commander with steely eyes. No, it won't. This time, we're the ones who are taking those green bastards by surprise. I trust you, Trollian. The ghosts of those dead boys will be fighting alongside us. They'll be at peace when we trap the orcs between two fronts. Trollian had shivered a little. Daneth, he had begun. Daneth waved it aside. I have no death wish, he said. Don't worry about that. I want to get home one day, and to bring these boys home with me. I don't want to write one damned more letter that begins with, it's with deepest sympathy. Trollian had gripped his second-in-command's shoulder and nodded. Daneth would hold the orcs long enough for the second force to crash upon them like a tidal wave. Kurdrin and his griffin riders, along with Khadgar and some other magi, would be ready to be part of that wave. Trollian would miss the mage's presence. They had been together throughout the Second War, and it would feel strange to go to battle without Khadgar by his side. But if all went well, they would meet up and celebrate their victory. Now he waited in the chill pre-dawn for the signal. Daneth's group had gone around, and would be attacking from the rear with horses and loud shouts, while Trollian's group had moved carefully, quietly on foot to a place close enough to see the signal, but far enough away that the night still hid them. He gazed at the citadel, at the mile-long, solid wall that encased it. At intervals along that wall, huge braziers burned sullenly, casting just enough illumination to show the barest hints of the iron spikes that adorned the citadel. Jagged, powerful, dark, the building had a vivid presence. Trollian somehow felt that not only would they need to defeat the orcs within the walls, the living ones and the Death Knights, but they'd have to defeat the citadel itself. It was an utterly hideous place, angular and organic at the same time, as if it were some massive beast whose flesh had melted in places to expose the sharp bones that had given it form. He stared at the watchtowers until his eyes ached from the strain. There, one of them had gone out, and then been relit. Once the final light had been doused and relit, Trollian heard the sound of human voices raised in a battle shout, and the thunder of hooves. He wanted desperately to charge in, but he forced himself to wait. The Rangers would need time and the opportunity to get to the gate, and that would only come when the orcs manning it had been called to fight Danis' men. Every second was agony. Finally, when he heard the sound of weapons clashing and the bellow of orc war cries mixing with those of his men, he knew the moment had come. Trollian lifted his hammer and raised it to eye level, where its dull metal head caught the early morning light. "May the holy light grant us strength," he said quietly, and those gathered around him nodded. A murmur spreading among them as his hammer began to shine and then to glow from within. "May it guide us in this endeavor, leading us to victory, to honor, and to glory." For an instant, the hammer seemed composed of white light. Then the light burst outward, washing across them all in a wave, and Trollian knew the others felt the same strength and peace he did. A faint aura clung to the hammer and to each of them. Trollian led his men at a fast lope toward the wall. The citadel loomed before them, and the closer they came, the more oppressive and mammoth it grew. He could see the gate now, looking like a mouth in a hideous face. And then, right when he was wondering if he had mistimed the charge, the gate began to open. "She did it," one of the men whispered. "Of course she did," Trollian said softly. "She's Ilaria Windrunner." Light, how he loved her. They were not the only ones who had noticed the gate opening, however. Even as Ilaria and her rangers darted forward to join with Trollian's group, a handful of orcs raced after them. Trollian caught a glimpse of Ilaria's golden hair in the faint light, and he sped up, breaking into a full run. His hammer rose almost of its own accord and began to glow again, a gleaming white light held high above his head. That caught one orc's attention, and the creature turned toward him instead of the rangers. It charged, and for a moment he thought it weaponless and mad, until he saw the scythe that served the creature for a hand. "For the sons of Lothar," the paladin cried, tongue liberated as the need for stealth evaporated. He brought the hammer crashing down, crushing the orc's skull. Even as the first orc dropped, Trollian hauled his weapon back around, striking a glancing blow to one in front of him before smashing an orc 2 paces over with his full strength. Another orc raced toward them, but an arrow suddenly protruded from its left eye, and it toppled without a sound. A fist snarled, swung the heavy club at its side, but Ilaria leaped forward, ducked the blow, and thrust, her sword blade piercing the green-skinned creature's throat and emerging from the back of its head. Trollian had spun and finished off the orc he'd stunned, and now he charged up the stairs at full speed, Ilaria and her rangers and his men right behind him. A troop of orcs met Trollian as he rounded a bend in the stairs halfway up. They had the advantage of size, strength, and position, but he had momentum and determination. Holding his hammer before him, his hands gripping it just below the head, Trollian used it like a small battering ram, slamming into one orc after another. The force of the impact jolted him, and he had to fight not to totter back a step. But the orcs found themselves tossed aside, and either slammed into the wall or toppled from the stairs and fell to the ground below. The orcs that retained enough presence of mind to attack him in turn found themselves pierced with arrows, courtesy of Ilaria and her rangers, and any orc Trollian stunned but didn't kill, the men behind him finished off as they raced up the stairs. In what seemed like minutes, but Trollian knew had probably been longer, he reached the top. The citadel's rampart stretched out before him, far longer than honor holds, but less even, more chaotic and oddly shaped. Some orcs stood there, heavy spears in hand, ready to hurl them down upon the approaching army. But most of the horde had poured out of the front gates. Trollian saw and were running to meet the alliance head-on. He also saw a long black figure circling above and knew the dragons were just waiting for the right moment to join the fight. "Alliance," Trollian shouted, holding his hammer high and racing to the rampart's front edge. "Alliance." From here he spotted Daneth, riding near the front of his group, and the warriors raised his sword in response. He was covered with blood and gore, but none of it was red human blood, nor had he lost many men. The light was with them. Then what orcs were still up here reached him, and Trollian was busy defending himself and clearing the ramparts of their defenders. The sounds of battle were everywhere. Metal against metal, stone against plate, flesh against flesh, mixed with growls and roars and bellows and cries. The bodies were all mingled together, and the green of the orcs against the pink of the humans, and the browns and blondes and blacks of the horses, with the gleaming sheen of armor and the dull luster of axes and hammers mixed in as well. At one point, when he was able to spare a glance, Trollian managed to pick out Daneth again, and watched as the warrior impaled a charging orc upon his sword, yanked the blade free, and whirled to slice another's throat open. Trollian had just smashed down the last orc when he heard a loud shriek from above. Glancing up, he saw a cloud sweeping down toward the citadel, carrying a blast of hot air with it. He grinned at the sudden moist heat. The cloud had broken apart, forming a haze that settled over the citadel, blanketing it in a fog that blurred edges and hid shapes and details. The fog played tricks with sound as well, and so when a loud whoop sounded, Trollian could not pinpoint its location. Neither could the dragons, it seemed, for they flew in circles, necks curling as they turned their heads this way and that, seeking the source of that sound. They didn't have to search for long. A small shape plummeted out of the fog, dropping like a stone toward one startled dragon. Just as they seemed about to collide, the shape extended, long wings unfurling, and its rapid descent became a sharp, wheeling dive. The griffin, for such it had to be, banked around the surprised dragon. The dragon snapped at it, like a dog at an insect, but the half-lion, half-eagle creature was too fast. It darted beneath the dragon as the mammoth's jaws closed right where it had been, and the dragon followed. It reared back, and magma spewed for a long time, spewed in a long fiery blast from its muzzle. Again the griffin and its rider were too quick. Over a dozen orcs shrieked in agony as the dragon accidentally incinerated its allies, too intent upon the swift griffin to notice where it had directed its attack. The dragon screamed in anger, slamming into the citadel and cracking the sturdy walls with a tremendous noise. Before it could gather itself and attack again, the wild hammer atop the griffin stood in the stirrups and hurled his storm hammer at the fearsome beast. As it struck the dragon in the eye, a thunderclap tore the fog asunder, and brilliant sunlight streamed down. The wild hammer whooped, his hammer returning to his hand as his griffin soared back up, the sunlight gleaming on its feathers. Shocked, dazed, the dragon tried to fly, but the merciless wild hammer dwarf led it on a merry chase, striking repeatedly at its wounded eye, until half-blinded and dizzy, it again slammed into the wall, which collapsed beneath the unintentional assault of the great beast. The dragon slid down to the earth, shaking with its dead weight, a victim of its own violence. The remaining dragons screamed their rage and hurtled toward the lone griffin rider, who turned to meet their furious headlong flight. But just as they neared him, more griffins burst from the remaining clouds above and descended upon the dragon. Each dragon was easily 4 times the size of a single griffin, But griffins had speed and agility, wheeling about the larger beasts, luring them to the fortress, directing their fiery attacks or sending them careening into one another as they tried in vain to catch the elusive aerial dancers. It looked to Turalyon as if Kurdran's earlier boost might in fact prove to be true. His wild hammers were having enough success with the dragons already that they might well be done with those creatures soon, enough to lend a hand with the main assault. One of the griffins broke away from the rest, heading toward Turalyon. It bore 2 riders, one small and the other far larger, and the latter leaped down while they were still a short ways above the ground, violet robes streaming around him. Turalyon felt his face stretch in a grin. Khadgar. The mage waved his thanks to the wild hammer who had carried him as the griffin beat its wings and rose back up to rejoin the aerial fray. Then he turned his white head toward the main tower, eyes narrowing. "I'll come help you when I'm done here," the mage said to Turalyon, gripping his staff in one hand and drawing the sword at his side with the other. "There's someone in there, an ogre mage. I need to deal with him first." Turalyon nodded. He'd seen more than enough magic over the past few years to respect Khadgar's opinion on the matter. He turned as 2 men stationed by the far stairs came hurrying over, broad grins on their faces. Before Turalyon could ask why, he heard footsteps from that direction, and then heads appeared as several figures charged up the stairs and onto the ramparts, figures wearing Alliance armor. "Sir," one of them called as they approached, "we have cleared the north wing." Turalyon nodded and returned the soldiers' salutes. "Good. I'll leave a few men here." He glanced at Ilaria, who readied her bow. "The rest of you, come with me. We'll sweep the citadel to make sure it's clean, and then throw open the gates for the rest of our men." They cheered, and he had led them down the hallway Khadgar had just taken, turning off it hallway across to follow a narrower stair down. As he'd hoped, it led him into the heart of the ogre stronghold, and soon Turalyon was too busy fighting off the orcs who had remained to worry about Khadgar. Khadgar paced the walkway slowly, his senses extended to study the area ahead of him. The ogre was still there, he knew, but did not seem to be doing anything. No spellcasting, no rituals. It was simply waiting. Waiting for him. The walkway ended at the tower, and Khadgar stepped inside. The room he entered was large and oddly shaped, not quite circular, with unevenly spaced angles, as if it had been carved from something rather than constructed. At the far end rose a monstrous chair that seemed to be pieced together out of colossal bones. He shuddered to think what beast might have yielded such specimens. Its high back reached almost to the arched ceiling above, and torches guttered to either side, but the throne was empty. "My master is gone," a deep voice rumbled, as a massive figure detached itself from the shadows and moved to intercept him. Khadgar had seen ogres before, of course, but they had been down on the field, and he had been back with the other magi, striking from a distance. This was his first encounter with one up close, and he found himself gulping as he stared up and up. The creature's head neatly brushed the ceiling, and while its features were brutish, its deep-set eyes glittered with intelligence. Then he registered what it had said, silently thankful for the ring that enabled him to understand it. "Gone?" The ogre grinned, revealing surprisingly small, sharp teeth and large fangs. "Indeed," it answered. "He left here some time ago. Even now he is traveling to perform the ritual, while your alliance is fighting its way past us." The creature scowled, then set its jaw. We may die, but our deaths will ensure that the Horde lives on and conquers worlds without end. Damn, Khadgar cursed, seeing what had happened. The orcs had tricked them. They'd allowed this attack simply so Ner'zhul could escape. Nonetheless, if we're fast enough, we can still go after him, he told the orc defiantly. You could, the ogre agreed, but first you must get past me. It raised its hand, each one larger than Khadgar's head, and they began to glow with a sickly green light that seemed to rise from beneath the skin. I am Dentarg, of the Shadow Moon clan. An honorable duel, then, Khadgar of Dalaran, Khadgar replied. He raised his staff, and the tip began to shed a bright violet glow. The ogre executed a clumsy bow, then it struck. Both of its massive hands slammed forward, as if physically shoving Khadgar back. Green light erupted from them in a wave of energy that threatened to envelop and crush the human mage. Khadgar raised his staff, the violet light growing more intense, and the green wave split around him before bubbling away to nothing. Next, Khadgar struck, pointing the staff at the ogre's chest. The violet light danced forward, stabbing toward the ogre's heart, but Dentarg batted the energy beam aside with his hands, the green stuff suffusing them, suffusing them, protecting him from any ill effect. We are well matched, the ogre remarked, clapping its hands together. When it spread them wide, darkness billowed up between them, a great curtain of black that swept across the room. Perhaps, Khadgar replied. He did not move as the darkness fell, and within seconds he had vanished from sight, as had everything else. Through his other senses, he could still locate the ogre, however, and knew that his opponent was searching for him. Khadgar waited another moment, unmoving, then slammed his staff down upon the floor. The shockwave split the darkness, cracking it as if it were a blackened glass, leaving slivers and shards of it upon the floor, and threw the ogre from his feet as well. The crash Dentarg made as he fell was almost equal to the first shockwave, and the ogre groaned in pain. Khadgar swiftly closed the distance between them. The light around his staff increased, until it was a beam of solid light, too bright to be violet though, still tinged with that hue. He slammed the beam-encased staff against the rising ogre's throat, and held on as Dentarg screamed, his flesh smoking where the staff touched it. It was not a magical attack that saved the ogre then, but an instinctive one. He heaved Khadgar off bodily and managed to regain his feet, though his neck bore a charred black line across it. Dentarg snarled, showing his fangs, and charged Khadgar head down. But the human mage sidestepped the attack and swung his sword as the ogre stormed past, slicing the creature's upper arm. Dentarg's cry changed from one of rage to pain. Green light rose again from his hands, though it flickered here and there, and flashes of crimson shot through it. Bringing his hands together again, Dentarg let the energy build between them, until he had a globe of pure magic that writhed and roiled with hatred. This he hurled at Khadgar, putting all his force behind it. Khadgar studied the fast-approaching globe calmly. Then he sheathed his sword and held out his hand, palm outward. The globe connected with his flesh, striking the palm squarely, and vanished into him, absorbed without a trace. Thank you, he told the astonished ogre. I feel much better now. He stamped one foot, and a minor shockwave toppled Dentarg again. The ogre landed heavily on his knees and bowed his head, knowing he was in the presence of a superior opponent. Khadgar spared him any further humiliation, drawing his sword again and bringing it down upon the ogre's exposed neck with all his might. Flesh and bone parted cleanly, and he stepped back as the ogre's head rolled across the floor, spraying blood in its wake. For a moment, he caught his breath, looking around the throne room, and thought he knew Dentarg had spoken the truth. He had looked down at the ogre corpse, nodded, satisfied, and hurried back to find Trollian. They would need to move quickly. "Good news," Trollian shouted when he caught sight of Khadgar again. "We hold the citadel." "We were tricked," Khadgar said without preamble. "Ner'zhul is not here. He left well before the attack. He must have taken the artifacts with him. I wonder if he took the skull as well." Trollian stared at him. "It was all a diversion then?" "And we fell for it," Khadgar confirmed. Trollian frowned, trying to find the good in this. "Still, this was undoubtedly the bulk of their warriors, and we crushed them. We've also taken their citadel. Even if Ner'zhul himself wasn't here, this was still their headquarters, and now it belongs to us. Their military might is broken for good." "Aye, they'll not field another army again," Dana said, approaching them in time to hear the end of Trollian's statement. His armor was battered in places, and he bore several cuts on his arms, legs, and face, but he seemed unfazed by the injuries as he reined in and dismounted beside them. Trollian clapped him on the shoulder, happy to see that his lieutenant had survived. "You did a fine job," he told Daneth, "but Khadgar has discovered some ill news. Ner'zhul is not here. He knew we would attack, apparently, and stole away before we arrived, and we think he took the artifacts with him." Alaria and Kurdran had joined them now, and Trollian filled them in as well. "Well, we'd best be after them, eh?" Kurdran replied. "Do you know where they're going?" Alaria replied. "I don't know," Khadgar said, "but I can find out." He smiled. "I know Gul'dan's magical aura from the war, and I know the Eye of Dalaran as well. I can trace both of them." The other stepped back as he closed his eyes, muttering something beneath his breath. The air around him seemed to shimmer slightly, and a wind appeared from nowhere, tugging at their clothes and hair. The mage's eyes snapped open. For an instant they glowed a brilliant white and showed strange images dancing within them. Trollian shuddered, looking away. When he turned back, his friend's eyes were normal once more. "I found them," Khadgar reported, leaning slightly against his staff. "It wasn't easy, though. Turns out they're in 2 different locations." Alaria shook her head. "The skull and the eye aren't together? Why would Ner'zhul let either one out of his sight?" "I don't know, but he has. The skull went north, but the eye is headed southwest, though through what I think they call Terakar Forest. I sensed the Book of Medivh there as well, which makes me think that's the way Ner'zhul went. I'd assumed that he needed the skull for ritual, just as I need the book and skull to close the portals, but apparently he sent the skull somewhere else, though I can't imagine why." "And you'll need both, the skull and the book?" Trollian asked. "Yes," Khadgar replied. "I can't close the rift completely without them." Trollian nodded. "Then we'll have to go after both," he decided. He glanced at the others, weighing options in his head. "Daneth, I think you'd like to kill a few more orcs." "Indeed, sir. Yes, I would." Trollian sighed. It pained him to see those he was so fond of revenge-ridden. But who was he to judge? He had not seen his whole contingent slaughtered while he fled to get aid. Daneth would have to make peace with his pain, in his own way, as Alaria had finally done. He would need to learn that you could fight without hate in your heart, fight for something, rather than against it. Then you go after Ner'zhul. He's got a head start on us. So Kurdrin, you and your Griffin riders scout ahead and find Ner'zhul and his companions. Attack them at once, kill them or at least slow them down, and report back to Daneth. He'll be following with ground enforcements. Take some of my rangers with you for scouting, Ilaria said. Trollian smiled his thanks at her and said to Daneth, your job is to destroy Ner'zhul and bring back those 3 artifacts. Consider it done, lad, Kurdrin replied, and turned away to his griffins. Daneth nodded, saluted, and went as well, to gather the men and get them ready for travel. Trollian turned back to Ilaria and Khadgar. Getting that skull and closing the portal are my responsibilities. Khadgar, you're the only one who can trace the blasted thing. And Ilaria, he smiled softly, I promised you I would never leave you behind. Indeed you did, my love, and do not think I won't hold you to it. He extended a hand, and she took it and squeezed it tight for a moment. There would be no more partings for them, until the final one. And maybe not even then. She grinned, let's go. Together the 3 friends turned away from the conquered citadel and the portal in the distance. They would find the ghoulish relic that would seal that rift forever, or die trying.